The office had emptied hours ago. Callum Weston sat alone at his desk on the 47th floor, the blue glow of his monitor casting long shadows across the cubicle walls. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan glittered like a jewelry box left open, indifferent to the man who sat watching it. He wasn't working overtime for ambition. He wasn't chasing a promotion or trying to impress anyone. He was simply waiting for Vivian Ashford to finish reviewing the quarterly reports because she had asked him to stay. And when the CEO asks, you stay. Callum was 36 years old, and he had spent the better part of his adult life perfecting the art of restraint. He had learned that knowing when to step back was often more valuable than knowing when to push forward. This philosophy governed everything from his approach to fatherhood to his conduct at Mercer and Holden, the investment firm where he had worked as a senior analyst for the past 4 years. His mornings began at 5:30, before his 7-year-old daughter Rosie stirred in her bedroom down the hall. He would brew coffee in the small kitchen of their 2-bedroom apartment in Hoboken, reviewing market reports on his laptop while the sky lightened over the Manhattan skyline visible through their window. By 6:15, he was preparing Rosie's breakfast, usually scrambled eggs and toast, sometimes pancakes if it was a weekend or if she had a particularly rough day at school. He had learned to read her moods from the way she shuffled into the kitchen, the angle of her shoulders, the brightness or dimness in her eyes. Single fatherhood had made him fluent in a language that most men never had to learn. Rosie's mother had left when their daughter was 2, not dramatically, not cruelly, just decisively. Serena had realized, she said, that she wasn't built for this life, this smallness, this routine. Callum had watched her pack her suitcases with a numbness that took months to thaw into grief. By the time the grief arrived, he was too busy changing diapers and warming bottles to fully inhabit it. Perhaps that was a blessing, or perhaps he had simply learned to compartmentalize so effectively that certain rooms in his heart remained permanently sealed. At work, Callum was known for his precision and his discretion. He spoke in meetings only when he had something worth saying. He never lingered at office happy hours, always citing Rosie's bedtime as his reason for leaving early. His colleagues respected him without really knowing him, which suited Callum perfectly. Connection, he had learned, came with complications he couldn't afford. The sound of heels on marble pulled him from his thoughts. Vivian Ashford appeared at his desk, phone in hand, a rare uncertainty flickering across her features. She was 41 years old, and she had built Mercer and Holden from a struggling boutique firm into a financial powerhouse with offices in New York, London, and Singapore. Industry profiles described her as brilliant and formidable, a combination that seemed to fascinate and terrify the business world in equal measure. What they rarely mentioned was the loneliness that accompanied such singular focus. Callum had observed her over his years at the firm. Not with romantic interest, he would have insisted, but with the careful attention of someone who understood that survival often depended on reading the room correctly. He noticed that she stayed later than anyone else, that her corner office light was always the last to go dark. He noticed that men who tried to charm her invariably retreated within weeks, and that she attended industry galas alone, despite being one of the most sought-after names on invitation lists. She was, he realized, surrounded by people who wanted something from her: access, influence, the prestige of association. What she lacked was someone who saw her as simply a person, complicated and uncertain and searching, just like everyone else. Now she stood before him, extending her phone with an expression he had never seen her wear in boardrooms. "I need your help," she said, "with my dating profile. Just technical feedback, nothing personal." Callum kept his expression neutral as he took the phone and began scrolling through the carefully curated images and precisely worded descriptions. 3 photographs. Vivian in a tailored blazer at some industry event. Vivian on what appeared to be a yacht in the Mediterranean. Vivian standing before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office, the Manhattan skyline sprawling behind her. Every image projected success, power, unassailability. Every image, Callum realized, was designed to intimidate. He scrolled to the biography section. The language was equally formidable, seeking intellectual equal with global perspective. Must appreciate fine dining, cultural institutions, and stimulating discourse. Advanced degree preferred. International travel experience required. Familiarity with contemporary art and classical music essential. It read like a job posting. A list of requirements that would filter out 99% of the population before they even considered reaching out. After a long moment, Callum looked up and spoke the truth. You wrote this to filter people out, not to invite them in. Vivian's expression flickered, a brief crack in the composed facade she wore like armor. Efficiency matters in dating as much as business. Why waste time on incompatible candidates? Candidates? Callum set the phone down on his desk. You're not hiring a vice president. You're looking for a partner. Is there a meaningful difference? The question landed with more weight than she had probably intended. Callum considered his response carefully. When I interview candidates, I'm evaluating their qualifications against predetermined criteria. When I was dating, before I stopped, I was looking for something I couldn't quantify. Chemistry, comfort, the sense that someone saw me, not my resume. Vivian was silent for a long moment. The hum of the building's ventilation system seemed suddenly loud in the stillness. Men are intimidated by me, she said finally. They approach with confidence, learn who I am, and retreat. The ones who stay want access or validation, not connection. I thought if I set the bar high enough, I might attract someone capable of meeting it. Or you might ensure that no one tries. The words hung in the air. Callum half expected her to bristle, to reassert the professional distance between them. Instead, she leaned against his desk, regarding him with something that looked almost like curiosity. You're suggesting I've constructed barriers unconsciously. I'm suggesting your profile reads like a warning label. Approach only if you're confident enough to survive scrutiny. Most people, even accomplished ones, don't want to feel like they're being evaluated. They want to feel wanted. Vivian's gaze drifted to the window, to the city lights twinkling beyond the glass. And what would you suggest instead? Write it like you're a person, not a position. Mention the things you love, not the credentials you require. Let someone imagine sitting across from you at breakfast, not negotiating a merger. The silence that followed was different, charged with something Callum couldn't quite name. When Vivian spoke again, her voice was lower, almost uncertain. Would you help me rewrite it? Not as an employee, just as someone who clearly sees things I've missed. Callum knew he should decline. Every instinct honed by years of careful boundary maintenance screamed at him to retreat to the safety of professional distance. But something in her question, something vulnerable and genuine, made refusal feel like cowardice. All right, he said, but we do it honestly. No curated perfection, just who you actually are. For the first time since he had known her, Vivian Ashford looked genuinely surprised, and beneath the surprise, something that might have been hope. They began that night, sitting side by side at Callum's desk, the glow of his monitor casting soft light across their faces. Vivian had pulled a chair over, close enough that he could catch the subtle scent of her perfume. Something expensive that he couldn't identify. He tried not to think about that. Tell me about your mornings, Callum said. Not the ones where you're running a company, the ones where you're just existing. Vivian frowned slightly. Most of my mornings involve running a company. Before that, before the emails and the calls, what's the first thing you do when you wake up? She was quiet for a moment, and Callum watched something shift in her expression, a softening around the eyes that he had never seen in boardroom settings. I make tea, she said finally. Earl Grey, very strong, with a little honey. I stand at my kitchen window and watch the sunrise over the park. Those 5 minutes before the world starts demanding things from me, they're the only peace I have most days. Callum typed. Mornings start with strong tea and stolen moments of silence. What else? I read. Not business books. Novels, old ones mostly. Edith Wharton, Henry James. I know it seems cliché for someone in my position to gravitate towards stories about society and status, but I find comfort in language that doesn't rush, he added to the profile. Find solace in old novels and unhurried prose. What about dinner? He asked. What's your ideal evening? Vivian laughed softly, a sound he realized he had never heard before. You'll think it's ridiculous. Try me. I like to cook. Simple things. Pasta mostly. I put on music, something quiet, and I take my time chopping vegetables. There's something meditative about it. The rhythm of the knife, the smell of garlic and olive oil. She paused. I've never told anyone that. It seems so ordinary. So beneath what people expect of me. Ordinary isn't beneath anything, Callum said. It's what makes someone real. He typed, happiest with homemade pasta and music playing low. As the evening wore on, they uncovered other details. Vivian loved thunderstorms but hated cold weather. She had wanted to be a writer when she was young, before pragmatism and family pressure redirected her toward business school. She found small talk exhausting, but could discuss philosophy or literature for hours. She was terrified of vulnerability, of showing anyone the soft underbelly beneath her armored exterior. And Callum, listening to her revelations, felt something crack open inside him. Not attraction exactly, though that was certainly present. Something more unsettling. Recognition. The sense that beneath all her achievements and his careful boundaries, they understood something fundamental about each other's loneliness. By the time they finished, the profile read like a completely different person. Gone were the demands and qualifications. In their place was a portrait of a woman who loved quiet mornings and old books, who cooked pasta when she needed to think, who was searching not for a partner who could match her accomplishments, but for someone who could sit with her in silence without needing to fill it. Vivienne read it 3 times, her expression unreadable. This doesn't sound like a CEO, she said finally. That's rather the point. It sounds vulnerable, exposed, like I'm inviting strangers to see the parts I've spent decades protecting. You asked for honesty. This is honest. She set the phone down slowly, and when she looked at him, her eyes held something he couldn't quite identify. Fear, perhaps, or hope, or some complicated mixture of both. You see me differently than anyone else, she said quietly. I'm not sure if that's terrifying or wonderful. Callum should have reminded her that he was just an employee offering feedback. He should have wished her luck with her dating prospects and returned to his work. Instead, he met her eyes steadily and spoke the truth. It's probably both. Vivian smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face into something softer, something younger. And then she asked the question that would change everything. Why don't you take me to dinner? Callum felt the air leave his lungs, not because of the words themselves, but because he understood instantly that something fundamental had just shifted between them. And there would be no pretending otherwise. The new profile went live the following morning. By afternoon, Vivian had received more genuine responses than she had gotten in the previous 3 months combined. Men wrote paragraphs about their own love of quiet mornings. Women, responding to her selection for both genders, shared their favorite novels and asked about her pasta recipes. The barrier she had carefully constructed had been replaced by a window, and strangers were peering through it with genuine interest. Callum knew this because she told him. She appeared at his desk during lunch, phone in hand, scrolling through the messages with an expression caught somewhere between amazement and terror. This is overwhelming, she said. They're all so sincere. I don't know how to respond to sincerity. You could start by being sincere back. She looked at him then, and a warmth spread through his rib cage that he hadn't felt in years. Over the following days, Callum watched from a careful distance as Vivian navigated this unfamiliar territory. She replied to messages, arranged coffee meetings, even went on what she described, with characteristic understatement, as preliminary encounters. He tried not to think about her sitting across from strangers in upscale cafes, offering them the vulnerability she had revealed to him. It wasn't his place to think about it. He was an employee who had helped with a personal project, nothing more. Whatever connection they had formed that night was circumstantial, born of late hours and unusual intimacy. It would fade. Except it didn't. Vivian began finding reasons to speak with him, questions about quarterly reports that didn't really require his input, requests for his opinion on matters far outside his job description. She would linger at his desk after delivering these pretexts, and their conversations would drift into personal territory. She told him about the dates she was going on, how the men were perfectly nice, perfectly appropriate, and perfectly wrong. How she kept comparing their conversations to the one she'd had with him that night. "They say the right things," she said one evening, perched on the edge of his desk while the office emptied around them. "They're successful, articulate, attractive, but talking to them feels like reciting lines from a script. There's no spontaneity. No friction. Friction isn't always comfortable." "No," she agreed, "but it's honest." The implication hung between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Preston Calloway had been watching. He was 52 years old, a board member with silver hair and the confident bearing of a man who had never been told no. He had pursued Vivian for 3 years with the patient determination of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted eventually. Her consistent refusals had not discouraged him. If anything, they had intensified his interest. Vivian Ashford was the only thing in his life he couldn't acquire, and that made her irresistible. Preston knew he had to be careful. Eleanor Vance, the board chairman, had been Vivian's mentor in the early days. The older woman had a reputation for seeing through corporate politics and protecting those she believed in. But even Eleanor couldn't ignore documented evidence of compromised leadership. Or so Preston believed. Now, observing the change in Vivian's demeanor, the softness creeping into her edges, the time she spent lingering at a certain analyst's desk, Preston felt something cold settle in his stomach. He approached Vivian after a board meeting, his smile polished and his voice warm. "I hear you're using dating apps now. Interesting choice, when the right person might be standing right in front of you." Vivian's expression remained pleasant but distant. "I appreciate the interest, Preston, but my personal life isn't up for discussion." "Of course, I just worry about you. A woman in your position, attracting the wrong kind of attention." He glanced meaningfully toward the main office floor, where Callum was visible through the glass. "Some people see opportunity where they should see boundaries." Vivian's smile didn't waver, but something hardened in her eyes. "Thank you for your concern. I'll keep it in mind." She walked away, and Preston watched her go with an expression that had nothing to do with warmth. Later that day, he intercepted Callum in the hallway near the coffee station. "Weston, isn't it? You and Ms. Ashford seem quite friendly these days." Callum kept his voice neutral. "We work together. Friendliness seems appropriate." "Of course." Preston's smile was a knife wrapped in silk. "I just hope you understand your position. Some people on the board are very protective of our CEO, very attentive to anything that might affect her focus." The message was clear. Know your place. Callum said nothing, but when he returned to his desk, his jaw was tight. They met at a small Italian restaurant in the West Village, far enough from the office that the chance of running into colleagues was minimal, close enough to feel like they weren't hiding. Callum had agonized over what to wear, finally settling on dark jeans and a button-down shirt, casual enough to signal that this wasn't a formal occasion, presentable enough to show respect. Vivian was already seated when he arrived. She had abandoned her usual power suits for a simple blue dress that softened her edges. Without the armor or professional attire, she looked younger, more approachable, almost uncertain. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she admitted as he sat down. "I wasn't either." They ordered wine and appetizers. The conversation began hesitantly, both of them navigating the strange territory between professional acquaintance and something more personal. But as the evening progressed, the awkwardness melted. Callum found himself telling her about Rosie, about the small rituals of their life together, about the guilt that still crept up on him when he couldn't provide her with a mother's presence. "Do you blame her?" Vivian asked quietly. "Rosie's mother?" Callum considered the question. "I used to. Now I think she did us a favor, leaving when she did. Better to have one fully present parent than two who are half absent." He paused. "I worry sometimes that I've used her departure as an excuse, a reason to avoid getting close to anyone again. Protection masquerading as principle." "Something like that," Vivian murmured. "I understand that more than you know." She told him about Graham, the man she had been engaged to before Mercer and Holden became what it was. He had known her when she was still struggling, still uncertain, still human. When the company started succeeding, when her name started appearing in magazines, he couldn't handle it. He said she had become someone he didn't recognize. He left, and Vivian learned that success was a form of armor, one that kept people at a distance whether she wanted it to or not. "So you kept succeeding," Callum said. "I kept succeeding, and with each achievement I became a little more untouchable, a little more alone." She met his eyes without flinching. "When you told me my dating profile was a barrier, you were describing my entire life. I've constructed myself into someone no one can reach." The confession hung between them, raw and undefended. His heart turned over. "What if we're both wrong?" he asked. "What if the things we think make us unworthy are actually the things that make connection possible? You're suggesting that our brokenness is an asset. I'm suggesting that pretending to be whole is exhausting, and maybe the only real intimacy comes from letting someone see the fractures." Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm scared," she admitted, "of wanting this, of believing it could work, of having it fail and proving that I was right to stay armored." "I'm scared too." "Then we're both terrified, which means we're either perfect for each other or we're making a spectacular mistake." Despite everything, Callum laughed. The sound surprised him, loose and genuine, a release of tension he hadn't realized he was holding. "Spectacular mistakes are underrated," he said. Vivian smiled, and something passed between them that felt like permission. Permission to try, permission to fail, permission to be imperfect and uncertain and still worth choosing. Callum introduced her to Rosie gradually, first as Dad's friend Vivian, then as someone who came to dinner occasionally, then as a fixture in their small kitchen, helping Rosie with homework while Callum prepared meals. Rosie, with the uncomplicated wisdom of childhood, observed this new presence with careful attention. One evening, after Vivian had spent an hour helping her with a difficult math assignment, Rosie looked up at her with those knowing eyes. "You're not like other grown-ups." Vivian paused, uncertain how to respond. "What do you mean?" "Other grown-ups just want to tell you things. You actually listen. You ask questions like you really want to know the answers." "Maybe I do really want to know." Rosie considered this. Then she delivered her verdict with the matter-of-fact certainty that only children possess. "Your eyes are sad like Dad's, like someone took something important away. But people with sad eyes are usually the kindest, because they know what hurting feels like." Vivian felt something catch in her throat. "You're the wisest child I've ever met," she managed. "I know. Grandma says so too." After Vivian left that night, Rosie tugged at Callum's sleeve. "You like her," she said. Not a question. "What makes you say that?" "Because you smile real when she's here. Not fake like with Mrs. Tamara from next door. Callum felt something loosen in his chest. He hadn't realized how much he had been holding his breath, waiting to see if the two most important people in his life could coexist. The rumors started slowly. Marcus Chen, a colleague who had seen them at the Italian restaurant, mentioned it to someone. That someone mentioned it to someone else. Within weeks, the office was humming with speculation. The CEO and the analysts, the late nights, the private conversations. Preston Calloway listened to these whispers with the patient attention of a predator watching prey. He began his campaign carefully, a raised eyebrow during board meetings when Vivian's name was mentioned, questions about her focus and availability, suggestions never stated directly that perhaps her attention was divided by personal matters. He recruited Miranda Holt, the HR director, as an ally. Miranda had her own reasons for resentment. Vivian had blocked a promotion she believed she deserved years ago, and the slight had festered. Together, they compiled a dossier, photos from the restaurant, statistics about Vivian's working hours, reports of concerning behavior from anonymous sources within the company. The trap was being set. And Vivian, lost in the unfamiliar terrain of new love, didn't see it coming. Callum saw it first. He requested a private meeting with Vivian, and they sat together in her office after hours, the door closed against prying eyes. "People are talking," he said, "about us, about the time we've been spending together. Preston Calloway is using it against you." "I know." Her calmness surprised him. "You know? I'm not naive, Callum. I've built an empire in a world that doesn't forgive women for having personal lives. I know how this game is played." "Then you know how dangerous this is. For you. For everything you've built." Vivian leaned back in her chair, studying him with an expression he couldn't read. "What are you suggesting?" Callum had rehearsed this conversation during the walk to her office, but now facing her, the words tasted like ash. "I should request a transfer, Singapore or London, somewhere far enough that the speculation dies naturally." Vivian was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was very quiet. "You would leave. Give up everything you built here because of whispers." "I would leave to protect you. Your position is precarious in ways mine isn't. A female CEO involved with a subordinate. The narrative writes itself. I won't be the reason your accomplishments are overshadowed by scandal. So your solution is retreat, distance, the same strategy you've employed for every emotional complication in your life." The words landed with unexpected force. Callum felt his jaw tighten. "That's not fair, isn't it?" Vivian stood and walked to the window, her reflection ghostly against the night sky. "Tell me honestly, Callum, are you leaving because you're worried about my reputation? Or because this is becoming real, and real terrifies you?" The question hung in the air, demanding an answer he wasn't sure he could give. Because the truth, the honest, unvarnished truth, was that both were true. He was worried about her, but he was also afraid. Afraid of wanting something he had convinced himself he didn't deserve. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted finally. "I've spent years building defenses, convincing myself that solitude was safety, and now you're standing on the other side, and I don't know if I remember how to let someone in." Vivian turned from the window. She crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough to touch him. Close enough that he could see the vulnerability she usually kept hidden. "Neither do I," she said. "But running away won't teach either of us. It will just confirm that we were right to hide. What's the alternative? Stay and let the rumors consume everything we've worked for? The alternative is that we face it together, openly, honestly. You transfer to a different division to eliminate the conflict of interest, and we let our work speak for itself." She paused. "Unless you have decided that what we've become isn't worth the risk." Callum looked at her. This woman who had built an empire through sheer force of will, now standing vulnerable before him, asking him to be brave. And he realized that running had never actually protected him. It had just delayed the inevitable reckoning with his own capacity for connection. "It's worth the risk," he said quietly. "You're worth the risk." Vivian worked with HR to restructure Callum's position. He was transferred to a different division, reporting to a vice president rather than directly to her. The move was presented as a strategic reallocation of talent, nothing more. Miranda Holt tried to obstruct the transfer, citing procedural concerns and suggesting that perhaps it would be better to let the situation resolve itself naturally. Vivian overruled her with a single sentence. "There is no situation. Process the transfer." The message rippled through the company. Whatever existed between the CEO and the analyst was no longer a conflict of interest, and anyone who tried to make it one would find themselves on the wrong side of Vivian Ashford's considerable will. But Preston Calloway was not easily deterred. He called an emergency board meeting. The subject officially was concerns about executive leadership. The real purpose was a coup. The night before the meeting, Marcus Chen appeared at Callum's apartment door. "I started this," Marcus said, his face tight with guilt. "The rumors, I mentioned seeing you two, and it spread. I didn't know Calloway would use it like this." He handed Callum a flash drive. "Miranda's been sloppy. She uses the shared server for everything, including her personal emails. I found these by accident, but you need to see them." Callum had spent the night reading emails between Preston and Miranda, dating back months. A systematic plan to undermine Vivian. Screenshots of rejected dinner invitations Preston had sent her over 3 years. Notes outlining strategy to force a leadership change. By morning, he had everything he needed. The boardroom was tense when he arrived. Preston stood at the head of the table, photographs and documents spread before him like evidence in a trial. Miranda Holt sat to his right, her expression carefully neutral. Vivian sat alone on the opposite side, her posture straight, her face revealing nothing. Eleanor Vance, the board chairman who had mentored Vivian in the early days, watched the proceedings with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "The evidence is clear," Preston was saying. "Miss Ashford has allowed personal matters to interfere with her professional judgment. She's transferred an employee to cover up an inappropriate relationship. She's been distracted and unavailable. The board has a responsibility to consider whether she remains fit to lead this company." He turned to the other board members, his voice dripping with false concern. "I don't raise these issues lightly, but we owe it to our shareholders to ensure that Mercer and Holden is led by someone whose focus is undivided." The board members shifted uncomfortably. This was the moment Preston had been building toward for months, years perhaps. The chance to remove the woman who had refused him and replace her with someone more amenable to his influence. Then Callum stepped into the room. "Forgive the interruption," he said, "but I think the board should hear another perspective." Preston's face darkened. "This is a private meeting. You have no business here." "I have every business here, since I am apparently the inappropriate relationship you're so concerned about." He walked to the table, placing himself between Preston and Vivian. "Mr. Calloway has presented what he calls evidence. Let me offer some context." He turned to address the board directly. "Ms. Ashford asked me to help her with a personal matter outside of work hours. A dating profile, if you want the truth. Nothing happened in this office. Nothing affected our professional responsibilities. But more importantly, let's look at results. Last quarter, under Ms. Ashford's leadership, this company posted its highest profits in 5 years. I personally brought in 3 major accounts during that period. Where exactly is the evidence of diminished capacity?" He pulled a folder from inside his jacket. "What I do have evidence of is this. Emails between Mr. Calloway and Ms. Holt, discussing strategies to, and I quote, neutralize the CEO. Meeting notes outlining a plan to use manufactured concerns to force a leadership change, and records of Mr. Calloway's numerous unsuccessful attempts to pursue Ms. Ashford romantically over the past 3 years." He laid the documents on the table. This isn't about protecting the company. This is about a man who couldn't accept rejection and a co-conspirator who's been nursing a grudge for years. The room went silent. Preston's face had turned an unhealthy shade of red. Miranda Holt was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Eleanor Vance picked up the documents and began reading, her expression growing colder with each page. The board deliberated for 30 minutes. When they returned, Eleanor Vance delivered the verdict. The board has reviewed all evidence presented today. We find no basis for concern regarding Ms. Ashford's leadership or professional conduct. She turned to Preston, her gaze unflinching. However, we have found substantial evidence that Mr. Calloway and Ms. Holt engaged in a coordinated campaign to undermine our CEO for personal reasons. This represents a serious violation of corporate governance and fiduciary duty. Mr. Calloway, your position on this board is terminated effective immediately. Ms. Holt, your employment with Mercer and Holden is ended. Security will escort you from the building. Preston sputtered, searching for words that wouldn't come. As he was led from the room, he turned to Vivian with hatred burning in his eyes. You'll regret this. Vivian met his gaze without flinching. You've regretted my first rejection for 3 years, Preston. I'm just glad it's finally over. That evening, Callum found Vivian on the balcony outside her office. The city spread beneath them, lights beginning to flicker on as dusk deepened into night. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the skyline. Thank you, she said without turning. You didn't have to do that. I did have to. I wasn't going to let anyone destroy what you've built, including me. She turned then, and he saw that her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I've spent my whole life fighting alone, building defenses, proving I didn't need anyone. You don't need anyone, but maybe wanting someone is allowed too. She laughed softly, a sound that held relief and exhaustion and something that might have been joy. When did you become so wise? I have a 7-year-old teacher. She's very demanding. Vivian stepped closer. Speaking of which, Rosie told me something the other day. Should I be worried? She said people with sad eyes are the kindest because they know what hurting feels like. Callum felt his throat tighten. She's not wrong. No, she's not. Vivian reached up and touched his face. Her fingers were cool against his skin. I love you, she said, not because you saved me today. Not because we've been through this together. I love you because that night, when I asked you to help me with a stupid dating profile, you looked at me like I was a person, not a CEO, not a conquest, just a person who was lonely and afraid. And I love you, Callum said, because you were brave enough to admit it. When I've spent 5 years pretending I wasn't lonely at all, he kissed her then. Softly at first, then with the accumulated weight of all the years they had both spent hiding from exactly this moment. And somewhere far below them, the city continued its indifferent glitter. But up here, on this balcony, 2 people who had built their lives around isolation finally let the defenses come down. 1 year later, the apartment was different now. 3 bedrooms instead of 2. Windows that looked out over Central Park instead of the distant Manhattan skyline. A kitchen large enough for 3 people to cook together without bumping elbows. Sunday morning light streamed through the glass as Callum stood at the stove, flipping pancakes. Rosie sat at the kitchen table, frowning at her homework. At 8 years old, she had grown 3 inches and developed strong opinions about everything from pizza toppings to presidential politics. Vivian stood by the window, a cup of Earl Grey warming her hands watching the sun rise over the park. Mom, Rosie said, I don't understand this math problem. The word hung in the air like a bell that had just been struck. Mom, Callum's spatula froze mid-flip. Vivian turned from the window, her eyes wide. What did you call me? Rosie looked up, confused by the reaction. Mom, you're here every morning. You help me with homework. You make Dad smile. That's what moms do. She returned to her worksheet as if she hadn't just redefined their entire family. Vivian crossed the kitchen and knelt beside Rosie's chair. I'm not your birth mother, sweetheart. You know that. I know. Rosie's voice was matter of fact. Dad says Serena wasn't built for this life. But you are. I can tell because you build everything. The company, dinner, and now us. Vivian's eyes filled with tears. She pulled Rosie into a hug, holding her tight. Callum stood at the stove, the pancakes forgotten, watching the two people he loved most in the world wrapped in each other's arms. And he thought about the man he had been 5 years ago, the one who watched his wife pack her bags and felt relief mixed with devastation. The one who had decided that if loving someone meant losing them, then he simply wouldn't love again. That man seemed like a stranger now, because hiding hadn't protected him. It had just been loneliness with better excuses. Dad, Rosie said, pulling back from the hug, the pancakes are burning. He laughed, turning back to the stove. Your fault. You distracted me with life-changing declarations. I'm 8. Everything I say is a life-changing declaration. Later, as they were getting ready to leave for the park, Rosie looked up at both of them with that knowing expression that made her seem decades older than her years. You know what I figured out? She said. What's that, sweetheart? Dad used to smile like he was pretending, and Vivian used to smile like she was practicing. But now you both smile like you forgot anyone was watching. She picked up her baseball cap. That's how you know it's real, when you forget to pretend. Callum and Vivian exchanged a look, out of the mouths of babes. They walked through Central Park, Rosie between them, holding both their hands. The October sun was warm on their faces. The leaves were turning gold and red, carpeting the paths with color. They passed the spot where Rosie had first asked Vivian if her eyes were sad. The bench where Callum had once sat alone, watching fathers with their children and wondering if he would ever feel whole again. Now he walked with his daughter on one side and the woman he loved on the other. Vivian pulled out her phone and scrolled to a screenshot she had saved. I kept this, she said, the original profile. The one you told me was a barrier. Callum looked at the screen, the yacht, the power suit, the list of requirements that read like a job posting. Seeking intellectual equal with global perspective, he read aloud, must appreciate fine dining and cultural institutions. Ridiculous, wasn't it? Terrifying, he corrected. I remember thinking, this woman doesn't want a partner. She wants a mirror. Vivian laughed. And now? Callum looked at her, at Rosie skipping ahead of them, at the life they had built from honesty and vulnerability and the simple act of being seen. Now I think you just needed someone brave enough to tell you the truth. And you needed someone stubborn enough to make you believe you deserved it. She took his hand. We rewrote more than a profile, didn't we? We rewrote everything. That night, after Rosie was asleep, Callum and Vivienne sat together on the couch. The city glowed through the windows. The apartment was quiet except for the soft sound of their breathing. I deleted the dating app, Vivian said, a long time ago. I remember you mentioning that. Do you know why? Tell me. She leaned against his shoulder. Because I found what no algorithm could provide. Someone who saw past the profile, past the CEO, past all the armor I'd built. She looked up at him. You asked me to write about who I really was, and in doing that, you became the person I wanted to share it with. The profile brought you hundreds of responses, Callum said, and you ended up with the guy who helped you write it. Maybe that was the point all along, finding someone who could see the real me, not just the curated version. She smiled. Although I'll admit, your editing skills were a factor. He laughed, pulling her closer. Outside, the city hummed its endless song. Inside, two people who had spent their lives preparing for solitude discovered something neither had expected. the extraordinary relief of no longer being alone. Sometimes happiness isn't found. It's built, brick by brick, choice by choice, one honest conversation at a time. Vivian had asked Callum to help her rewrite a dating profile. What neither of them knew was that they were rewriting their entire lives. Three people, two lonely hearts, one family, built from the courage to be seen. That's the only love story that matters. The one where you finally stop hiding and let someone in.